Chapter 2 Nihon-Ja, some months earlier. Horace slid the screen to one side, grimacing slightly as he eased the door open. By now, he had learned to handle these light wood and paper structures carefully. In the first week in Nihon-Ja, he had destroyed several sliding panels. He was used to doors that were heavy and needed some effort to get them moving. His hosts were always quick to apologize and to assure him that the workmanship must have been faulty, but he knew the real reason was his own clumsiness. Sometimes he felt like a blind bear in a porcelain factory. Emperor Shigeru looked up at the tall Araluen warrior, noticing the extreme care he took with the door, and smiled in genuine amusement. "Ah, Osan," he said, "you are most considerate to spare our flimsy door from destruction." Horace shook his head. "Your Excellency is too kind." He bowed. George, an old acquaintance of Horace's from his days in the ward at Redmont and his protocol advisor on this journey, had impressed upon him that this was not done out of any sense of self-abasement. The Nihon-Jan bowed to each other routinely as a mark of mutual respect. In general, the depth of the bow from both sides was the same. However, George had added, it was politic to bow much deeper to the Emperor than you might expect him to bow to you. Horace had no problem with the custom. He found Shigeru to be a fascinating and gracious host, well worthy of deference. In some ways, he reminded Horace of King Duncan, a man for whom Horace had the deepest respect. The Emperor was a small man, much shorter than Horace. It was difficult to estimate his age. The Nihon-Jan all seemed much younger than they really were. Shigeru's hair was tinged with grey, so Horace guessed that he must be in his 50s. But small as he might be, he was amazingly fit and possessed a deceptive wiry strength. He also had a surprisingly deep voice and a booming laugh when he was amused, which was often. Shigeru clicked his tongue lightly as a signal that the young man didn't need to hold the position any longer. As Horace straightened up, the Emperor bowed in reply. He liked the muscular young warrior, and he enjoyed having him as a guest. In training sessions with some of the leading Nihon-Jan warriors, Shigeru had seen that Horace was highly skilled with the weapons of his own country. The sword, longer and heavier than the curved Nihon-Jan katana, and the round shield that he used so effectively. Yet the young man showed no sense of arrogance and had been keen to study and complement the techniques of the Nihon-Jan swordsman. That was the purpose of Horace's mission. As a swordsmaster in Araluen and as a potential battlemaster, it made sense that Horace should be familiar with as wide a range of fighting techniques as possible. It was for that reason that Duncan had dispatched him on this military mission. In addition, Duncan could see that Horace was becoming bored. After the heady excitement of his clash with the outsiders in company with Will and Holt, it was easy for the young man to become impatient with the humdrum routine of life at Castle Araluen. Much to the chagrin of Duncan's daughter Cassandra, who enjoyed Horace's company more and more, he had sent him on this fact-finding mission. "Look at this, Osan," Shigeru said, beckoning him forward. Horace smiled. None of the Nihon-Jan had been able to master the pronunciation of his name. He had become used to being addressed as Osan. After a few early attempts, Shigeru had cheerfully adopted the simplified version. Now he held out his cupped hands to Horace, and the young man leaned forward to look. There was a perfect yellow flower nestled in the Emperor's palm. Shigeru shook his head. "See," he said, "here we are, with autumn upon us. This flower should have withered and died weeks ago, but today I found it here in my pebble garden. Is it not a matter for thought and wonder?" "Indeed it is," Horace replied. He realized that he had learned a great deal in his time here, and not all of it about military matters. Shigeru, even with the responsibility of ruling a varied and, in some cases, headstrong group of subjects, could still find time to wonder at the small occasions of beauty to be found in nature. Horace sensed that this ability led to the Emperor's enjoying a great deal of inner peace and contributed in no small measure to his ability to face and solve problems in a calm and unflustered way. Having shown the flower to his guest, the Emperor knelt and returned it to the neatly raked array of black and white pebbles. "It should remain here," he said. "This is where its fate decreed that it should be." There were stepping stones through the garden so that the Emperor and his guest could avoid disturbing the symmetry of the raked stones. It was like a stone pond, Horace thought. He was aware that each morning the Emperor would rake the pebbles into a slightly different pattern. A lesser man might have had servants perform this task, but Shigeru enjoyed doing it himself. "If everything is done for me," he had explained to Horace, "how will I ever learn?" Now the Emperor rose gracefully to his feet once more. "I'm afraid your time with us is coming to an end," he said. Horace nodded. "Yes, Your Excellency. I'll have to return to Iwanai. Our ship is due there at the end of the week." "We'll be sorry to lose you," Shigeru said. "I'll be sorry to go," Horace replied. The Emperor smiled, "but not sorry to return home." Horace had to smile in return. "No, I'll be glad to get home. I've been away a long time." The Emperor gestured for Horace to follow, and they left the pebble garden and entered a perfectly cultivated grove of trees. Once they were off the stepping stones, there was room for them to walk side by side. "I hope your trip has been worthwhile. Have you learned much while you have been with us?" Shigeru asked. "A great deal, Your Excellency. I'm not sure that your system would suit Araluen, but it is an interesting one." Nihon-Ja drew its warriors from a small elite upper class known as the senshi. They were born to be trained in the art of the sword and began their training from an early age, to the detriment of most other forms of learning. As a result, the senshi had become an aggressive and warlike sect, with a sense of superiority over the other classes of Nihon-Jan society. Shigeru was a senshi, but he was something of an exception. Naturally, he had trained with the katana since boyhood, and he was a competent, if not an expert warrior. As Emperor, it was expected that he should learn these skills. But he had wider interests, as Horace had just observed, and a compassionate and inquiring side to his nature. He was genuinely concerned for what were held to be the lower classes, the fishermen, farmers, and timber workers, who were regarded with contempt by the majority of senshi. "I'm not sure that we can maintain it as it is for much longer in this country either," he told Horace, "or that we should." The young warrior looked sidelong at him. He knew that Shigeru had been working to improve conditions for the lower classes and to give them a greater voice in how the country was governed. He had also learned that these initiatives were highly unpopular with a significant number of the senshi. "The senshi will resist any change," he warned the Emperor, and the older man sighed. "Yes, they will. They like to be in charge. This is why it is forbidden for the common people to carry arms or learn any weapon skills. They far outnumber the senshi, but the senshi make up for the lack of numbers by their skill with weapons and their ferocity in battle. It's too much to ask untrained fishermen or farmers or timber workers to face such deadly opponents. It has happened in the past, of course, but when the workers did protest, they were cut to pieces. I can imagine, Horace said. Shigeru stood a little straighter, held his head a little higher. But the senshi must learn. They must adapt. They cannot continue to treat the people, my people, as inferiors. We need our workers, just as we need our warriors. Without the workers, there would be no food for the senshi, no timber for their homes, no firewood to heat them, or for the forges that create their swords. They must see that everybody contributes and there should be greater equality. Horace pursed his lips. He didn't want to reply because he sensed that Shigeru was setting himself an impossible task. With the exception of the Emperor's immediate retainers, the majority of senshi had shown themselves to be fiercely opposed to any change in the current system, particularly if it gave greater voice to the lower classes. Shigeru sensed the young man's hesitation. "You don't agree?" he asked mildly. Horace shrugged uncomfortably. "I agree," he said, "but my opinion doesn't matter. The question is, does Lord Arasaka agree?" Horace had met Arasaka in the first week of his visit. He was the overlord of the Shimonseki clan, one of the largest and fiercest groups of senshi warriors. He was a powerful and influential man, and he made no secret of his opinion that the senshi should remain the dominant class in Nihon-Ja. He was also a swordmaster, regarded as one of the finest individual warriors in the country. Horace had heard rumours that Arasaka had killed more than 20 men in duels, and even more in the internecine battles that flared from time to time between the clans. Shigeru smiled grimly at the mention of the arrogant warlord. "Arasaka-san may have to learn to agree to his emperor's wishes. After all, he has sworn an oath to me." "Then I'm sure he'll honour that oath," Horace said, although he had grave doubts about the matter. As ever, Shigeru saw past the words themselves and recognized the concern in Horace's voice. "But I'm being an impolite host," he said. "We have a little time left together, and you should enjoy it. Not spend it worrying over the internal politics of Nihon-Ja. Perhaps we can ride together to Iwani. I'll have to be leaving here soon to return to Ito myself." They had spent the past week relaxing in the informal atmosphere of the Emperor's summer lodge, at the foot of the mountains. His principal palace and seat of government was a magnificent walled fortress in the city of Ito, a week's ride to the south. Their time at the lodge had been pleasant, but, as Shigeru had noted earlier, autumn was forcing its way across the land, with its cold and blustery winds, and the summer lodge was not the most comfortable accommodation in cold weather. "I'd enjoy that," Horace said, pleased at the prospect of spending a few more days in Shigeru's company. He wondered at the bond of respect and affection that he felt for the Emperor. Perhaps it had to do with the fact that Horace had grown up as an orphan, and so he was drawn to Shigeru's understated strength, gentle wisdom, and unfailing good humour. In some ways, the Emperor reminded him of Holt, although his smooth good manners were a marked contrast to the ranger's often acerbic nature. He gestured to the carefully cultivated trees around them, their leaves now blazing yellow and orange to herald autumn. "I should tell George to start making preparations for the trip," he said. "I'll leave you to contemplate your trees." Shigeru, in his turn, gazed at the patterns of dark trunks and blazing leaves around him. He loved the peace and solitude in this garden, far away from the self-serving politics of the capital. "Their beauty will be small recompense for the loss of your company," he said smoothly, and Horace grinned at him. "You know, Your Excellency, I wish I could say stuff like that.